Back in the 1980s, the world was watching three huge elections happening in Central America. But the real story wasn't just about who won or lost. It was about how that story was told to the rest of us. So today, we're going to dig into a really fascinating analysis of the media's coverage of elections in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, and what it tells us about the powerful link between the news we consume and foreign policy.
So this really gets to the core question, right? When the media reports on elections in other countries, is it using one single yardstick to measure how democratic they are, or does that yardstick kind of change depending on whether a country is an ally or an adversary? The source we're looking at today argues that these three elections, all from the same time period, give us the perfect test case to find out.
Okay, so let's dive in. What makes this a perfect test? Well, think about it. You had two elections in El Salvador and Guatemala, which were, at the time, U.S. client states. The U.S. government was deeply invested in making them look good, look democratic. And then, at the very same time, you had an election in Nicaragua, whose government the U.S. was actively trying to overthrow. You've got the same region, same time frame, but completely polar opposite political goals. It's a perfect setup for a comparison.
Now, to really get the argument here, you have to understand this key concept: demonstration elections. The idea is that some elections aren't really for the people voting. They're basically a performance, a show put on for the audience back home, in this case, the American public. And the whole point of the show is to prove that U.S. foreign policy is noble and democratic. This analysis basically labels the elections in El Salvador and Guatemala as exactly this type of performance.
So if you've got two completely different goals, you're not going to use the same strategy, right? Of course not. The central claim here is that the U.S. government essentially created two totally separate playbooks for how to frame these elections, one for its friends and a very, very different one for its enemies.
And this slide just lays out those two playbooks so clearly. For the friendly states, El Salvador and Guatemala, the media narrative, the stuff that was on agenda, was all about high voter turnout, how the army was heroically protecting voters from rebels. But anything that might ruin that picture, things like state terror or a complete lack of basic freedoms, that was all kept off the agenda. But for the enemy state Nicaragua, the playbook just gets completely flipped. Suddenly, voter turnout is ignored. The army is repressive. And all those things that were off limits before, now they're front and center.
And get this wasn't just some theory. The source points to a pretty stunning admission from a senior U.S. official who was talking to a group of election observers. He explained that a hostile country could be a threat to U.S. security, and then he said, quote, "That allows us to change our yardstick." I mean, it's about as direct an admission of a double standard as you can get.
Okay, so that was the government's alleged strategy. But how did that line up with what was actually happening? With the reality on the ground? Let's take a look at what the analysis says about the actual conditions for a free and fair election in each of these countries.
Wow. I mean, this table from the source is just incredibly stark. It looks at 5 basic conditions you'd need for any free election. And for El Salvador and Guatemala, the conclusion is that none of them were met. State terror was out of control, basic freedoms just didn't exist. But then you look at Nicaragua, and the contrast is huge. It finds that conditions were way better. The absence of state terror met, freedom of organization met, and other freedoms were at least partially in place.
So this is the really crucial point, this massive paradox. According to this analysis, the two countries where a truly free election was pretty much impossible because of the terror and lack of freedom, those are the ones that got glowing, positive media coverage. And the one country where conditions were actually much better, that's the one that was systematically torn down and delegitimized in the press.
And that, of course, brings us right back to the media's role in all of this. The source claims that the news coverage didn't just happen to line up with the government's two playbooks, it was a near-perfect mirror image. So let's see the evidence they present to back up such a strong claim.
I mean, that's a pretty bold claim, isn't it? So is there any actual hard data to support it? Well, the source provides a quantitative analysis of the coverage from a major newspaper, the New York Times, to see exactly what topics got talked about and which ones didn't for each election.
Okay, let's look at the numbers for El Salvador. More than half the articles mentioned rebel disruption. That was the government's preferred story. High turnout and the army as a protector were also big themes. But look below the line at the off-agenda items. State terror and the climate of fear, only mentioned in 11% of articles. And what about freedom of the press or freedom to organize? Zero. Absolutely zero. Not a single article focused on those fundamental issues.
Okay, now, let's immediately contrast that with the coverage of Nicaragua's election from the exact same year.
The shift is just stunning. Rebel disruption, which was the #1 story in El Salvador, is now down to just 5%. Turnout, 0 mentions. Instead, the top stories are all the off-agenda things from before. Limits on candidates, lack of free speech, lack of press freedom. It's like they literally flipped the script. The entire frame of reference was inverted to perfectly match those 2 playbooks we saw earlier.
So, what's the big picture here? Why are we talking about this today? Why does an analysis that's almost 40 years old still matter so much? Well, because it reveals something really fundamental about how information can be shaped to support foreign policy, sometimes completely separate from the facts on the ground.
The conclusion of the source material is, well, it's blunt. It argues that in these specific cases, the mass media was effectively serving a propaganda function for the state. It helped make illegitimate elections look valid, and it helped make a more credible election look like a total sham, which perfectly served the government's foreign policy goals at the time.
So, what are the big takeaways for us? Well, first, that the framing of a story, what's put on the agenda versus what's kept off, can be way more powerful than the facts themselves. It shows how positive coverage can make a state look legitimate, even in the face of terrible human rights abuses, while negative coverage can do the exact opposite. Oh, and the analysis also points out how official election observers can be used to just reinforce whatever story you want to tell. It's a huge reminder to always ask yourself, what part of the story am I not being told?
And that kind of leaves us with one last big question to chew on. This analysis focused on 3 elections a long time ago, but the core idea is timeless. If the media, whether it's conscious or not, is following a pre-written script or a playbook, whose story are we, the audience, really hearing? Is it the story of the people actually living through these events, or is it the story that someone else wants us to believe?